Good morning. Welcome to Kenya News Update today. We begin with an urgent call from one of the nation's most prominent religious bodies. The Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims, SUPKEM, is demanding that President William Ruto's administration declare the ongoing drought a national emergency. This isn't just a request for aid. It's a stark warning that what we are witnessing across 23 counties has escalated into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The council's national chairman, Ali Haj Hassan Ole Nado, made this impassioned plea during a press conference in Nairobi, calling for the immediate mobilization of all national water resources, including water tankers from the National Youth Service. But what does declaring a national emergency actually mean? And is the situation truly severe enough to warrant such a drastic step? Today, we take a deep dive into the drought, the politics of disaster declaration, and the human cost of a changing climate. We'll examine the data, hear from experts on both sides of the debate, and assess what a national emergency declaration could and could not achieve for millions of Kenyans facing hunger and thirst. Let's first understand the scale. When SUPKEM says 23 counties are affected, they're referring to nearly half of Kenya's 47 devolved units. But the impact isn't uniform. The arid and semi-arid lands, the ISALs, are bearing the brunt. We're talking about regions like Turkana, Marsabit, Wajir, Mandera, and Garissa. The last 4 consecutive rainy seasons have failed. That's 2 years of significantly below average rainfall. The meteorological department's data is unequivocal. The October to December 2025 short rains were between 40 and 60% below the long-term average in these regions. The March to May 2025 long rains were even worse, with deficits exceeding 70% in some areas. This isn't just a dry spell, it's a prolonged climatic shock. The ripple effects are catastrophic. Pasture has withered, water pans have turned to dust, and rivers that communities have depended on for generations are now mere trickles or completely dry. The National Drought Management Authority's latest report classifies 15 counties in the alarm phase and 8 in the alert phase. In human terms, that translates to over 4.1 million people facing acute food insecurity. That's a population larger than Nairobi County needing urgent assistance to survive. Of these, an estimated 942,000 are children under 5 and pregnant or lactating women who are acutely malnourished. Livestock, the primary asset and source of livelihood for pastoralist communities, are dying in alarming numbers. Preliminary estimates from county governments suggest at least 2.5 million livestock deaths have occurred since the drought intensified in mid-2024. For a family that relies on 10 goats for milk, meat, and as a form of savings, losing 8 of them is an economic catastrophe from which recovery takes years, if not generations. This brings us to SUPKEM's central demand, a formal declaration of a national emergency. What does this entail legally and practically? In Kenya, disaster management is guided by the Disaster Risk Management Act of 2021. A national emergency declaration is the highest level of alert. It's a legal instrument that unlocks several critical mechanisms. First, it allows for the immediate reallocation of funds from the National Contingency Fund without going through the lengthy parliamentary appropriation process. This fund is specifically designed for such crises. Second, it empowers the National Disaster Operations Center to assume direct command and control, coordinating all response efforts from government ministries, county governments, NGOs, and international partners under one unified structure. It cuts through bureaucratic red tape. Third, it often triggers accelerated procurement procedures for essential supplies like food, water, and medicine. Fourth, and crucially, it sends a powerful signal to the international community and donor agencies, potentially unlocking additional humanitarian funding and support. SUPKEM's argument is that the current piecemeal, county-by-county response is insufficient. They point to the mobilization of NYE's water tankers as a perfect example of a national asset that should be deployed at scale, immediately. Chairman Ole Nado stated, and I quote, "The government must treat this with the urgency of a war. Our people are dying not from bullets but from thirst and hunger. This is a silent war, and it requires a wartime response." The council emphasizes that this is not a political or religious issue, but a national humanitarian one that transcends all divides. However, the government's perspective is more measured, and it's here where the debate intensifies. Senior officials from the Ministry of Interior and the State Department for Arid and Semi-Arid Lands have publicly acknowledged the severity of the drought. They point to the ongoing Kenya Hunger Safety Net program, the distribution of relief food by the National Cereals and Produce Board, and the trucking of water by county governments as evidence of a robust response. Their central counterargument to an emergency declaration is twofold: capacity and precedent. On capacity, they argue that the existing disaster management framework, led by the NDMA, is already functioning and scaling up. Declaring an emergency, they suggest, might create panic and an unmanageable influx of aid that the current logistical chains cannot handle. A senior official who spoke on condition of anonymity told us, "We are responding. We have allocated over 12 billion shillings for drought response in the current financial year." An emergency declaration is a tool, not a magic wand. It doesn't create food or water, it just changes how we access resources we may not fully have. The second point is precedent. The government is wary of setting a precedent where every severe drought triggers a national emergency. Kenya is a drought-prone country. Since the year 2000, the country has experienced 6 major drought episodes in 2000-2001, 2004-2005, 2008-2009, 2016-2017, 2020-2022, and the current one beginning in 2024. Declaring an emergency now, the thinking goes, might create an expectation for every future event, potentially diluting the significance and urgency of the declaration itself. There's also a political economy consideration. A national emergency could be seen as an admission of policy failure in long-term climate adaptation and resilience building, shifting focus from development to pure relief. To unpack this debate further, we need to look at the numbers behind the response. Let's examine the resource allocation. The government's stated 12 billion shilling allocation sounds substantial, but when broken down per person in need, the picture changes. With 4.1 million people in acute need, that's approximately 2,927 shillings per person for an entire year. That's less than 250 shillings per person per month. Contrast this with the cost of a single 90-kilogram bag of maize, which has fluctuated between 6,000 and 8,000 shillings in these regions due to scarcity. The math simply doesn't add up to sustained relief. Furthermore, reports from the ground in counties like Torka, Na indicate significant delays in the distribution of this allocated aid. Beneficiary lists are contested, logistics are hampered by poor infrastructure, and the sheer geographic vastness of the affected areas makes delivery a monumental challenge. This is where proponents of the emergency declaration argue it would help, by centralizing command and streamlining these very processes. They cite the response to the 2011 Horn of Africa famine, where a delayed international declaration contributed to the deaths of an estimated 260,000 people in Somalia, half of them children under 5. The lesson, they say, is that early and decisive action saves lives and is ultimately cheaper than a belated, massive relief operation. Beyond the immediate humanitarian response, this drought exposes deeper, systemic vulnerabilities in Kenya's approach to its arid lands. For decades, the development model for the ISALs has oscillated between neglect and emergency relief. Long-term investments in climate-smart agriculture, sustainable water harvesting like large-scale sand dams and subsurface storage, pasture management, and livestock value chains have been underfunded. The drought is not the cause of the crisis, it is the trigger. The root causes are poverty, marginalization, and a lack of resilient infrastructure. A pastoralist in Wajir told our correspondent, "The drought kills our animals, yes, but it is the only thing the outside world sees. They don't see the years we have no market for our animals, the lack of schools for our children, or the clinics without medicine. The drought finishes what neglect started." This sentiment echoes in the demands of many civil society groups who support SUPKEM's call, but add a crucial caveat: any emergency declaration must be coupled with a binding commitment to a post-emergency Marshall Plan for the ISALs. It must be a bridge to development, not just a lifeline for survival. So, where does this leave us? The evidence on the ground overwhelmingly supports SUPKEM's characterization of a humanitarian crisis. The numerical data on rainfall deficits, food insecurity, malnutrition, and livestock deaths paints a dire picture. The government's argument about managing capacity and precedent has administrative merit but risks being perceived as bureaucratic inertia in the face of widespread suffering. The debate ultimately hinges on a value judgment. Is the current multi-agency response, however well-intentioned, adequate to prevent large-scale loss of life and the total collapse of livelihoods? Or does the scale and urgency of the threat demand the singular focus, unlocked resources, and heightened coordination that only a formal state of national emergency can provide? International observers, including the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, have already classified the situation as a top-tier emergency requiring global attention. Perhaps the question for President Ruto's administration is not if Kenya can manage without the declaration, but whether it can afford the risk of not making it. The cost of being wrong, of underestimating the crisis, is measured in human lives. The cost of declaring an emergency, if managed transparently, is measured in shillings and administrative effort. As the sun beats down on the cracked earth of the north, millions of Kenyans await the answer. This is not just a policy decision, it is a moral one. For Kenya News Update today, I'm your host. Remember to subscribe for in-depth analysis on the stories that shape our nation.